Saat Farkı'ndan merhabalar. Her hafta farklı ülkelerden, farklı milletlerden konuklarla bölgesel ve küresel gelişmelere, meselelere dair farklı perspektiflere yer vermeye çalışıyoruz. Bu hafta stüdyoda bir konuğum var. İngiliz akademisyen Dr. Marc Owen Jones, dijital medya ve siyaset üzerine çalışıyor. Katar'da bulunan Hamad bin Halifa Üniversitesi'nde görev yapıyor. İstanbul'a bir konferans için geldi. Gelmişken kendisini yakalamak istedik ve yeni çıkan kitabı şöyle de gösterelim. Digital Authoritarianism in the Middle East, Ortadoğu'da Dijital Otoriterlik başlıklı yeni yayınlanan kitabını konuşmak istiyoruz bugün. Biraz dijital medya siyaset ilişkisi üzerine, sosyal medyanın nasıl manipüle edildiği, nasıl kullanıldığı hükümetler veya hükümet dışı aktörler tarafından biraz bu konuları konuşacağız bu hafta. Welcome, Dr. Marc. Thank you very much for joining my program.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you very much. Congratulations for the book.
Again, thank you.
So we will talk about the book, Digital Authoritarianism in the Middle East. Well, as a way for governments to control their citizens through technology, digital authoritarianism is surely not just limited to the Middle East, but also being promoted by well-established democracies. So first of all, I want to get a global perspective first before focusing on the region. How governments and other non-state actors use social media and digital technology in the Middle East and beyond? What is the global trend? What are some common practices? So could you give us some broad picture first?
Yeah, I think all governments use forms of digital technology to control their populations, right? They do it in different ways. So for the global perspective, a common one is social media. Social media is everywhere: Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, TikTok. How can these technologies be leveraged to use to spy on people? So for example, what we see in the US is data being harvested from citizens, given up, and that data is then used and sold to companies. Where we see in the Middle East that data is often used for other ways, like can we use that information to figure out who this person is and then use that information to either arrest them or incriminate or imprison them. But then there's more sinister things at play. Look at, for example, the US. Yeah, it's one of the world's biggest democracies, but we know from years ago, the Edward Snowden leaks revealed that they have the ability, in theory, to access your email, your Gmail, your private information. The British even had technology that could access your webcam and go through your laptop and see what you're looking at. So this is some examples. What we're seeing more and more in the Middle East in particular is the use of often European or Israeli technology to called spyware, things like Pegasus, which is sent maliciously, like as an email attachment or just via your iPhone. And what this does, it accesses your phone and it's able to look at your WhatsApp, your text messages, to activate your microphone and record your private conversations. These are things that are happening too. This is more surveillance. And then we have the disinformation.
Of course, yeah, we will talk a lot about
that. Which we will talk about.
And as you said, when it comes to disinformation and fake news, the world's media usually tends to focus on like Russia or China, countries like Russia and China, but your focus is on the Middle East. Now we will talk about that. And it's not secret that a lot of regional countries, such as United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, is heavily investing in this field. I want to ask you, Dr. Jones, which countries are posing a serious threat to digital security, do you think? And which ones do you consider as most dangerous, and why?
In the Middle East, I would say Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and in Israel, depending on how you define the Middle East. And what I call these are digital superpowers. So what is a digital superpower? A digital superpower is a country that can use digital technology, both domestically, regionally, and internationally, to try and either control its population or to influence populations abroad. And the reason why I say the UAE and Saudi in particular, in the Arab world, are the most dominant, is because we've got evidence to show that they are using these techniques, more so than any other countries. And I'm happy to give examples about it. And so, for example, Saudi is a particularly interesting case. We know that since the rise of Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince and the de facto ruler, that they've been adopting multiple techniques. One of them is to control Twitter with the use of electronic flies, which is a term that they use that means Twitter armies. So they pay people to actually engage in propaganda, intimidate and harass people online. And the thing is, what matters when you're a digital superpower is your population. In the Arab world, Saudi is one of the most populous states. It's not the most populous, but it has the deepest technological infrastructure. So it's able to leverage its population and its petro resources to pay people to actually engage in this propaganda. And they do operations abroad. We've seen pro-Saudi accounts manipulating the timeline, the Twitter timeline of the former US President Donald Trump. They actually manipulated his timeline. They sent and paid spies in Twitter's headquarters in San Francisco Even recently, a jury found a man guilty of spying for Saudi Arabia. This guy actually worked inside Twitter, and they found him guilty of taking money in exchange for taking private information from Saudi Twitter users and then sending them back to Saudi Arabia. This is really egregious. And crucially, we can actually quantify it. So let's take examples. Twitter. Twitter publish archives of what they call state-backed influence operations. This is Twitter accounts that they believe are run by governments to spread propaganda and disinformation. If you count the list of which country has actually got the most accounts in these takedowns, the top one is China, but number two isn't Iran or Russia. It's Saudi and the UAE combined. And they combine them because they can't even tell which one's different. When Twitter put them down, they put Saudi and the UAE together as these info dumps. So there are means of detecting this. In terms of surveillance, we know that UAE and Saudi are big customers of Pegasus, the Israeli spyware, and they've used this against citizens, but crucially journalists. Up until recently, the largest known hacked group of journalists using Pegasus was Al Jazeera journalists. So we know that they have a track record of using it, more so than any other country in the Gulf. And the reason they can is because they have the money. And we know with Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Zayed, these guys are rising sultans, right? They see themselves as changing the destiny of the region. And they want to create a power bloc that's a counter to Iran and Turkey in the region.
Mm-hmm. By the way, Dr. Jones, I also want to ask you, how influential or how impactful, what is the role of social media on popular uprisings in the region? Because Arab Spring was a very good example, I think, for internet and social media can be used to disrupt democracies as well as it can also destabilize dictatorships. Yeah. So I really wonder the role of social media on the Arab Spring and also the other popular uprisings. And a follow-up question maybe, not just as a journalist, but as an active Twitter user, I want to ask you, how do you notice a manipulated campaign, for example? Because sometimes, and most of the time, what looks like a genuine popular frustration is in fact triggered by fake accounts. So how do you differentiate? How do you notice that? What is the fine line here?
Well, these are all important questions. I mean, I'll go back to the first one, which is the role of social media in the Arab uprisings. And it's a really good question, because in 2010, 2011, when the uprising started, everyone was talking about the positive techno-utopian vision. Social media was going to bring democracy to the Arab world. And to a certain extent, this is true. But I need to be clear about this. The impact of social media, I think, was overstated, right? Yes, it was important, but we had lots of other things happening at the time. We'd come out of a recession. Subsidies were being removed. For example, in Egypt, there was years or even decades of activism against continued authoritarianism. And all these things came together. And yes, a spark, the self-immolation of Mohammed Bouazizi in Tunisia was really important in this. And people were able to use social media to network. But it was also the traditional media, traditional internet media, like forums, that were really important. And this allowed people to network. What I will say, it's not social media in itself. It's people's attitudes to social media that define it. And what I would say, when a new technology comes out, we have a honeymoon period. And the honeymoon period is when people are naive about social media or a new technology. So they will use Twitter, they will use Facebook and think, oh, I'm going to connect to this person who looks like an activist. We'll start the conversation. We'll connect to another person. This creates networks. And you need these networks to resist authoritarianism. The problem is that people didn't realize by doing this, they were also falling into traps. By talking to an anonymous account, posing as activists, they could have been talking to the mukhabarat and the secret police. Right. And this is exactly what was happening. Soon regimes realized this. So what they did, they co-opted social media and they started to use social media as an intelligence gathering thing. So we did have a period, I think, where social media was important, but it wasn't social media per se. It was people's naivety around social media that allowed it to be effective because it allowed them to network. But soon regimes shattered these networks, and I think that's really important to bear in mind.
So then after the Arab Spring, authoritarian regimes even, it contributed to the rise of digital authoritarianism even further after the Arab Spring, definitely.
Because what happens with authoritarian regimes is no regime is static. Industrialization, times change, technology change. An authoritarian regime has to adapt to new threats. Right. That's how they survive. They wouldn't be authoritarian regimes if they didn't survive. So when a new technology comes in, even, there's the example in Iran in the 70s, what did people used to do? They used to share cassettes with sermons from religious leaders, but this was banned. That was the new technology. Now it's digital media. So regimes have to think, how can we control this new technology? And this made them react, create new laws, create new techniques of repression. So in a way, what you're seeing is yes, it did lead to the rise of digital authoritarianism. But this was just a reaction against this moment of freedom.
Then I will come to this point then, because I also want to ask you, what are the potential solutions for creating a less authoritarian space? What should be the role of international organizations, big technology firms in, limiting or censoring information and news? Should national governments be more involved? Because I always think because when they are too much involved, then there is a risk for, more state control. So what is the balance here? What should be the role of governments and other non-state actors?
These are really big questions and important questions, how to regulate the space. And I think, again, it depends on the government. Not every government is the same. There's very few examples of governments, whether they're democratic, authoritarian, that have been successful and able to tackle the problem. But the important thing as well, there's different strategies within the disinformation and the digital authoritarianism system that can be tackled, right? I just need to give an example because we're talking about a big problem.
Please give an example. We can't just fix.
But for example, let's have a look at what some of the disinformation you see in the Arab world. How is it created? It's not just created by the regimes. We have, and I mention it in the book, there's a British company, fancy British company, works from Mayfair, really well-paid graduates from maybe Oxbridge. Right? They work for a PR company. The PR company gets hired by the UAE Supreme Media Council to do a negative smear campaign, in this case about Qatar, calling people terrorists and stuff. So in this example, there's a British company linked to Cambridge Analytica, whose job it is literally to create hostile, negative disinformation about another country that could, in theory, lead to conflict. How do you solve that problem? Well, you could address it at the social media level, or, for example, you could go to the UK government, and this is what they have in the US, and say, listen, you need a registration database of any company who takes money from a foreign power to engage in these kind of operations. And maybe that will cut out one bit of that problem. It's not going to solve it, but I'm just saying that the problem is huge. How do you address it? You have to address it in different ways. The government thing is important. I don't think anyone can trust their government to control social media.
Right.
That's why you need to control, have these other solutions around the problem that help at least address this information.
Dr. Jones, I also want to ask you a question about Turkey, because there's an interesting case about Turkey. According to an Oxford report published a few years ago, in 2018, Turkey was the country most exposed to disinformation, with 49%. Why do you think that is the case, first of all? And what makes some countries more vulnerable to disinformation and fake news? And a follow-up question, because we have a very limited time left. I know that you have analyzed some hashtags and digital campaigns in Turkey. So what are your observations, I wonder?
Turkey is a large nation. It's at the fulcrum or the center of Asia and Europe. It has an interest in Syria. It has an interest in the Middle East. Other states have interest in it, like Russia and Saudi. Anytime there's this combination of interest and you're a large power, you're going to get disinformation campaigns. But let me say another example. Let's go back to the Middle East specifically. Why was it the target of disinformation? Well, part of that was the rise of Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Zayed. They wanted to create another bloc to oppose Iran and what they saw as Turkey, right? Because they viewed Turkey, Qatar, as this creating an Islamist movement within the region, and they wanted to fight against Islamism. So what that created was this swathe of propaganda and disinformation targeting the actions of Turkey. So in a way, the disinformation in that context was related to the foreign policy objectives of those states. But you could also look at Russia, you could look at, for example, Turkey's involvement in Syria, you could look at the Kurdish issue. There's all sorts of interest groups who might want to target the Turkish government, because this face of information warfare, disinformation, propaganda, is the new frontier. In terms of Turkey, I think Turkey has been the victim of it. I analyzed last year this Help Turkey campaign.
Yeah,
Turkey
during the forest fires.
Yeah. People trying to, and this makes sense because people want to try and tap into real important issues, and these are important issues ecologically, but ones that make the Turkish government look weak. But at the same time, the Turkish government obviously have their own disinformation apparatus. They are able to mobilize their resources, and it's not just the government, it's parties. Political parties will have their disinformation apparatus that they then have to use, or that they use anyway, to try and, influence the public debate. And this goes back to the question you asked earlier about these legitimate concerns. If you're a political party now, then why wouldn't you have some sort of propaganda outfit whose job it is to monitor social media and try and influence people's debates? And that's the scary thing about digital authoritarianism. We don't know how much of the conversations out there are happening because they're organic or because they're actually started or initiated by the governments, political parties, or these companies working in London.
And there's no way for an ordinary person to Notice
For the
this,
most
right?
part, no. I mean, you can apply...
I mean, we should be an expert like you to know this.
Well, there's some things that can give it away, but generally speaking, these things are not easy to spot because you have to sometimes look at a large data set to find patterns and anomalies in order to detect manipulation. And you can't always just do that instantly. But maybe, you can spot a bot account because they type in all caps. Or maybe, for example, it's a really old account made in 2012 and they only have 4 tweets. There's little things like that, but these aren't great ways of identifying fake accounts. Often you have to look at thousands of accounts and then compare them to each other in order to find.
It's a lot of work, yeah.
It is a lot of work. That's why I'm here. I'm failing.
Dr. Jones, one final question about this huge debate around Elon Musk's Twitter buyout. I mean, he terminated the deal, but he suggested that there are more bots and fake accounts on the platform than the company claims. So I was wondering, was he right? What is the real prevalence of bots and all these fake accounts on Twitter, and what's the impact of them on public opinion globally?
Look, as much as I hate Elon Musk, I think he might have a point. I mean, studies have actually looked at how many bots there are on Twitter, but the range varies. Some people estimate up to 30% of accounts on Twitter are bots. Some say maybe 5%, right? So there's a huge kind of variation. My own experience would suggest that Twitter does not do a good job of getting rid of the bots. So I think there's a lot more bots than Twitter say. In terms of influencing debate, it's very hard to determine. But think of it this way. There's debates that need to be had that aren't being seen because Twitter bots can, raise the prominence of certain trends and decrease the prominence of others. And I think at the end of the day, most of us, at least, have probably witnessed some news that's been created by a bot or a troll, and maybe we've been influenced in it.
Right.
The big scary thing is, how do we know we've been influenced by something fake if we don't know it's fake? And
exactly.
This is the scary
that's
thing.
The whole question.
Yeah. And so I think the problem is huge. It's much bigger than Twitter would let on. It's the only time I've ever agreed with Elon Musk. But yeah, I think they are having a massive debate in Arabic language, in the Middle East in particular. The majority of conversations are probably by bots or trolls or pro-government accounts. So the whole civil society, the public sphere, the space in which we're meant to discuss things, like in a democratic debate, is being dominated either by bots or trolls or just pro-government accounts. And that's a big problem.
And what is your advice for random people poor random people on social media, on Twitter? Just 1 minute, please.
I think my advice is always this, I could joke about it and say leave Twitter, which is one form of advice, but also if something looks too interesting or too juicy or too salacious, don't retweet it. Think twice, because it could, and most likely, is fake news. Because one of the things we know about fake news is it spreads much faster than truthful information, and it's easy to make fake news because you don't have to be responsible. You're a journalist, you should know. And so I think it's designed to appeal to our emotional senses. So if something makes you feel particularly emotional, question it.
Okay, thank you very much for the advice, Dr. Jones. Thanks so much for participating in my program. And again, congratulations for the book, and I'm looking forward to reading it in Turkish as well for the Turkish readers.
I'll learn Turkish quickly then.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Evet, Saat Farkı'nda bu hafta Dr. Marc Owen Jones'u ağırladık. İngiliz akademisyen, dijital medya ve siyaset ilişkisi üzerine çalışan. Son olarak da tekrar kitabını gösterelim. Dijital Otoriterlik, Ortadoğu'da Dijital Otoriterlik isimli bir kitabı da çıktı yakın zaman önce. İngilizce okuyan izleyicilerimizin okumasını tavsiye edelim. Alanında önemli bir çalışma. Önümüzdeki hafta yine farklı bir konuyla, farklı bir konukla görüşmek dileğiyle. Hoşça kalın.